Well, look, thank you very much for hanging around to listen to me talk. I do feel like I've got a hard act to follow, having seen the lineup this morning with both eminent international experts in Terry and David coming. But I guess I could perhaps give more of an Australian flavour and a bit more of my perspective and the way I see things sort of feasibly going forward for my patients with ITP and patients in Australia in general. And I just wanted to talk a little bit in general terms about why there might be difficulties with how you as people and patients with ITP are going to have problems, not just now, but in the short term in the future. I tell my patients that, and I sympathise with my patients because I feel ITP is a really difficult disease in lots of different ways. It's really difficult because you don't know when you've got it. And even your doctor often doesn't even know when you've got it. When you turn up to your doctor, they sometimes change their mind about what's going on with you. It takes us a while to figure out or to confirm the diagnosis, and that's built into the definition of it because it's a diagnosis of exclusion. We have to do a whole bunch of tests and be convinced there's no other reason why your platelet counts are low before we can call it ITP. We have no tests to confirm it. There's no lab sample you can run. There's no X-ray you can take to say, yep, you've got it. There you go, definitely. That's okay. Yeah. I didn't mean to shock you with that news, but sometimes you will have had an infection just before you turned up with bleeding or bruising or a low platelet count, or you were on a new medication a few weeks before and no one really knows whether that was the cause for your platelet count to fall, and we have to stop it or we have to wait for your infection to get better before we can be certain. So it can take a long time before you actually get a diagnosis, and that uncertainty is sometimes paralysing. ITP is not a disease or a diagnosis that a lot of people know a lot about. You kind of either have to have it or have a close family member with it, or you have a medical background or a health-related background to even know what ITP stands for. I have to explain ITP to my best friends all the time, what I do and what I'm trying to treat. And look, the other thing that's really frustrating about ITP is it's 2019, and the first line of treatment that we often use comes from the 1950s. The surgery that we sometimes talk about but not always use was thought up of 100 years ago. We're still stuck using treatments off the bat that belonged decades ago. And I'm sure it feels like there's a lot of research going on in lots of different diseases, lots of different areas, including ITP, and you'd Google it, you'd look it up, you'd find about it, people would tell you about it. But quite often, not a lot of it seems to have much impact or much ability to influence how you're being managed by your doctor. So it feels like you're being left behind. The information you get online is sometimes very helpful, but in the end, if that information doesn't translate into something physically different about the prescription you're going to get or how your disease is going to be managed, then it's nice to know about it, but how's that practically going to make your life any better? So it's hard to take control over your disease and your health if you don't have ways of measuring it or ways of keeping a tab on it other than platelet counts that, for example, your doctor might have filed away in their record about you in his office. You don't know where you're going to go to next with your next line of treatment if the current one's starting to fail. A lot of things are always up in the air. As doctors, we often have differing opinions, and sometimes there's a difference of perspective, and if we can't agree on tests or on the usefulness of certain treatments, how are we supposed to be able to guide you in any way that fills you with confidence? How do you know what's going to happen next if your doctor doesn't know what's going to happen next? We don't even have a simple answer to the most basic question of which of the two main steroids should we prescribe for you if you were to ever need treatment up front for ITP. We still debate about it. Every year there's always another trial or a publication comes out trying to argue one way or the other, and often with very limited difference between them. So we need solutions. We need solutions through basic research, through clinical trials, but also through engaging with our community, with our stakeholders, with our patients, with our pharmaceutical companies, with our governing bodies. Personally, my bias is we need to sharpen our tools before we know which tool to use. We need to be able to diagnose the disease better. We need to be able to understand what's going on before we start trying to fix what's wrong. And we also need to design trials and recruit to clinical trials in a way that's going potentially to change the way our regulatory bodies determine what drugs are funded and what drugs are not. It's great to show that a medication works and is safe, but if it's not going to have a health economic benefit to the Commonwealth, it's not going to get funded. When you're faced with a disease like ITP, which has no imminent prospect of death, that yes, it has an impact on your quality of life, but there are lots of treatments that kind of work okay and kind of keep you going. How would a governing body with a limited amount of funds decide to commit a proportion of that money to some new fancy medication if it's only equivalent to what's already out there, or only slightly better to what's already out there? So we need to find ways of trying to convince people who make those sort of economic decisions that the next treatment or the new ways of treating ITP are going to provide benefit not just for you but also for society as a whole, because we live in a society where we have a universal healthcare system, and that's just our system. That's what we live in. And finally, this is part of my bias, that ITP is not actually a single disease. How can you expect to run a trial that's going to have a really high success rate if you're actually recruiting people with different diseases that might have a similarity, that their platelet counts are low or that their immune system has something to do with it? But the immune system is quite complicated. There are lots of different agents and different players, and some of the tools that we use in clinical trials might target just one or two of those. A lot of you would already know about the way ITP comes around, that you have platelets circulating in the bloodstream. The spleen obviously has something to do with it, because sometimes taking out the spleen makes a big difference. The platelets come from the bone marrow, and there's something about the liver making a hormone that influences the bone marrow to make more platelets. And so in that little scheme, if something goes wrong, then you might have a problem with the number of platelets you have. And many people in the past have done historically very important experiments to show that there's something in the bloodstream that if you take it from a person with ITP and you inject it into yourself, you can actually recapitulate ITP in yourself by taking that substance from the bloodstream. So I tend to feel that ITP, even though it's a disease with at least a few different headings for a few different types of things that go wrong, like you're not making enough platelets, or there's something wrong in aspects of your immune system. It's more complicated than just suppressing the immune system. There's literally hundreds of publications every year finding evidence that there are niche particular things that go wrong in a small number of people that laboratory has examined. And those results aren't always the same for other people with ITP. And so the way I see it is that we call it ITP as a disease because it's convenient. But in all of us with ITP, there's a different problem in what's going on in your immune system, which is why we can't always predict that the treatment that works for you is going to work equally well for the next person. So part of understanding the difficulty with clinical trials in ITP, for me, is to recognise that there's not going to be a silver bullet. Not commonly, not unless your bullet involves affecting a range of targets. And that's why steroids, which affect a range of targets in the immune system, work so well in most people with ITP. And if any of you have had immunoglobulin infusions that have a range of ways in which they work, or taking out the spleen, which has a range of effects on your immune system, or giving you lots of that TPO hormone, which again kind of bypasses the immune system a little bit and just gets you to make more platelets. That's why those treatments have such a high success rate compared to treatments that try to eliminate just one or two targets. But that's not to say those highly selective tools are ineffective for everyone. There are people who respond quite well occasionally to drugs that have a very low success rate in terms of for everyone else. So some of you might have been on a medication which only works 40% of the time or 50% of the time or less. But you might be one of those 40% where it's worked spectacularly well. So maybe our problem is we're just not using the right medication for the right person, not that we need to find a better medication. So in Australia, we have a very limited repertoire of clinical trials that are active to recruitment right now. In fact, the only one that is on the clinical trials register and active at the moment would be for people in Brisbane. If you are at all in any contact with someone like Rob Bird or at Monash, there are other sites coming forward for a medication which even I have very little experience with, but we hope to bring to Canberra for a short period of time, called PRN 1008. But even then, that window of opportunity to access a clinical trial of that nature is often very small. And as I heard last night, this is a pretty good example of what I'm talking about, a medication which might hope to affect a part of your immune system, shall we say, to improve ITP, but has been tested in a small number of people somewhere else overseas. And by the time it's looking promising, there's only a small opportunity to access that trial medication for people in Australia. And so for us, we would be given no more than a few months window to be able to recruit onto this study, as far as I've recently been informed by the study coordinators. But of course, in time to come, that might change. There'll be more studies with that particular medication. So there's hope. The other big area in which there are sometimes clinical trials that will come and go in Australia are trials involving the use of that hormone-type medication, eltrombopag and romiplostim, in earlier and earlier phases of disease. But I mean, they're great in concept, but I suspect they're going to be quite limited in the way that they're going to influence the way our Commonwealth makes decisions about what medications to fund. These studies it wouldn't be sufficient to just show that the medication works or that it's safe. The studies need to show that there's some kind of significant benefit over alternative available strategies in order to be funded. So it's great if you can get onto these studies without having needed to go through a splenectomy. But in terms of the bigger picture for what's going to help Australia and Australians with ITP, it's just it's probably not the way we're going to make change. That's how I see it. I tend to sort of break down clinical trials that you might read about or hear about on social media or on the internet into three sort of broad groups. There's a lot of trials, particularly coming out of China, that are registered where they're using natural therapies in sort of medically controlled ways, like extracts that are found in licorice, which, conceptually can't be that bad for you, and other kind of herbal remedies and naturopathic sort of treatments that, in a way, probably has a low risk of harm. Then there are other clinical trials, again, not anything open in Australia at the moment that I know of, repurposing medications or treatments that we already know about, maybe for a slightly different disease, maybe for a slightly different indication, but medications that aren't likely to be that dangerous because we've got some familiarity with them. We've used them before in some way. And so some of you may have heard of using Tamiflu or some of those sort of medications that are used in influenza, for example, for ITP. But my personal bias is it's only going to help a very small sort of proportion of people with a very severe end of ITP. And then there's trials that involve something new, something totally new, something that we haven't really used much before. And those trials, like I said before, the window of opportunity for a lot of Australian sites is often quite small. It's often quite limited for various reasons that are not always in our control. But I would say to you, sometimes it's worth considering how participating in a clinical trial is right for you as a person. Do you like the idea of trying something that might involve a little bit more risk? Medically controlled, but still something a bit new, versus do you prefer to be someone who would just, let's try something a little bit less likely to cause any problems? And in that way, if and when there's an opportunity to choose, try to choose something that works for you as an individual. Don't just go with whatever's available. So at least in the Australian context, some of us in the ITP field are working very hard trying to devise different clinical trial protocols and ideas for ways in which we might be able to use some of these new medications like eltrombopag and romiplostim, but in a way that might be able to influence the way our governing bodies determine the health economic benefit, so that we can get these medications more readily available without you guys needing to have your spleens taken out. And finally, there is also a bias that some of us have in using combinations of treatments, again, where splenectomy or romiplostim or eltrombopag is not available, using combinations of medications out of respect to the fact that the immune system is not a simple system. There are lots of different parts of the immune system that are seen to have a problem with it, with ITP. So if you want to affect change, you might need to target a broader range of sites if you want to make a difference. I would also like to talk a little bit about how not just in the context of clinical trials, but also in terms of the way you approach your own disease, taking ownership over your ITP. Now, in Australia, we've recently had the introduction of this thing called My Health Record, where the government's keeping a record of your health in ways that even I, as a doctor, I can't easily tap into what's in my own My Health Record. And so you can't fact check what's in your own health record if something's been listed as an allergy, or if there's a disease that you didn't think you had or your doctors thought you might have, but suddenly it's listed as you definitely having it. That kind of stuff is a little bit irksome, particularly when you have no control over it, particularly when you can't even see it or access it yourself. And look, this idea sort of that I'm going to talk about sort of came to me because I was seeing a second opinion from someone who actually came from Melbourne to come up to see me in Canberra. And he actually had a beautiful graph of his platelet counts and the treatments that he'd had, and was able to show me, so this is me, what do you think? And in a snapshot, I had an opportunity to really understand his journey, because it's not, actually I'm with this man for a moment in time, but his disease is not just that moment in time. It was from when he was diagnosed. It's the weeks of being on steroids. It's the rituximab that he had and it didn't work. It's the Helicobacter pylori antibiotics he had and made no difference. And for me to casually consider repeating things that didn't work makes no sense. But when you don't have, as a patient, that information with you, if you're not, technologically advanced to have that with you, then how can you trust that another opinion you get or the doctor that you're seeing is going to go through your notes and pull out that information? How many of you here have a phone in your pockets? How many of you have checked for messages while I've been talking? Anyone? So how many of you have taken a photo using your phone to show your friends that you've come to Melbourne for this talk, or you posted it on Instagram or Facebook or something like that? How easy is that to do if you had a bruise or mucosal bleeding that you're worried about, or if you had more bruising or blood spots than what you remembered having or think you should have had? And it's fine to accumulate photos in the cloud or in your Apple account or whatever, but when you're sitting there in the doctor's room and they're saying, oh, how have you been? You're not going to go fumbling through your personal photos of your son's birthday party amongst the bruising and the bleeding, unless you were super organised and you had it in folders, you had it in some way that could bring that information together. So what I would propose is, instead of trying to collect information about yourself in a haphazard way, or compiling a database or filling out Excel spreadsheets about your platelet count, wouldn't it be great to be able to pull out a graph and say, this has been my journey, this is what's happened, this is what's going on, these are the doses you had me on last year that didn't work, these are the times that I had my bruising or bleeding. You can see very clearly when and where and how bad it was, if at all, maybe none. But it's there in your pockets, in your hands, and something you can absolutely share with your doctor. It's not just for you to agonise over at home on your own, but it's a way of you taking control over your own information again. And that's why one of the directions that I'd be proposing, and one that I'm in negotiation with and talking to Danielle and others about, is trying to build up from scratch a new mobile app that you guys can walk around with and use as much or as little as you like. But you might find that it's pretty easy to take a photo of your prescription box, and just like it can pick up your credit card number, it picks up what dose of medication you're on. I mean, how easy would that be for your teenage son to do instead of having to type it in? To take photos of your bruise and it's already tagged to that date, so you don't have to remember to pull it out. Or a pathology provider plugging in the platelet count directly into your phone, so you don't have to keep calling the GP's secretary to beg for your own result, right? I mean, who has had to go through that already? Yeah. And yet it's your information, it's about your own health, and if you want to know about it, you should have access to it. And of course, if you have that information handy, when those little windows of opportunity come up for a clinical trial where we need to assess you quickly, what have you been on, what's worked, what's failed, what hasn't worked, when you have that information already with you, it'll make it a lot easier for that trial coordinator, for that doctor who's umming and ahhing and thinking about it, to say, yeah, actually you're right, nothing else really did work, or yes, you have had lots of really bad bleeding issues, and I can see why you're worried and why you want to try desperately something else, because it's here in front of you. This is not a replacement for your medical records, and it's not a way of you treating your own disease, but it's just a way of you being a partner in making those decisions about your own health. And this is, to me, a big area of need and a big gap in the way a lot of my patients have their ITP treated. I still have patients right now who conscientiously ask for their platelet count, and I see them tapping it into their spreadsheet or into their thing at home. They come to me with graphs not as colourful as the ones I've just shown you, but people are trying to track it themselves. And look, there is an ITP tracker app even right now that I don't know how many of you have downloaded onto their phone. I've downloaded it to sort of see what it's like. This is the only one that I can... Yeah, exactly. It's the only one that I could find that we could access from Australia. It's awful because the units are all not the units we use in Australia. The drug names are not some of the drugs we don't have access to in Australia. They have generic names. We don't use the trade names that we're familiar with in Australia. Clearly, it's probably been funded by Amgen because there's no mention of Eltrombopag, and these sort of things. You start to wonder, which is why it's great that we get industry support where we can. But I think a purpose-built app like that needs to come from a patient group, from an advocacy group, from people who are invested in the disease for the sake of the disease rather than to sell the idea in any way. So that's kind of all I really had to talk about. I mean, I was asked to talk about Australian clinical trials in ITP, but actually, apart from PRN 1008, there are none, and there are ones that will come and will go, and the window often opens and closes, and they're not often trials that you can plan to participate in because you kind of have to be usually not doing very well in order to get onto those trials. And I would like to think most of you here would be active and on top of your ITP, or trying to be on top of your ITP as best you can.
So those trials run by the drug companies, like, right?
Yeah, generally what they do is they kind of they employ sort of third-party companies to sort of run the trial itself, so that there's like an arm's length. Obviously, when it comes to analysing the data and reporting on the usefulness and the safety aspects of it, there's a lot of involvement from luminary experts like Terry and David, who You know if their names are on the publication, if it's unlikely that you couldn't trust, what comes out. But you're right. I mean, there's always going to be conceptually a bias towards trying to show that something works well or something is safe, because millions of dollars have been poured into that kind of development. But the problem with our universal system is, like I said, it's not good enough to just show that it works or that it's safe. It's got to be cheaper. It's got to be safer. It's got to be better by a fair margin to be able to get through our pharmaceutical advisory board, to be able to commit those millions of dollars to accessing that medication. And look, clinical trials are great because they fill a need. But to me, still, the end game is how are we going to make things easier for everyone? How do we make things better for the longer run? And so for me, when I try to think of trials or try to think of what to do next, it's with a view to how we're going to make a difference to the future, not just for the 5 people that I get onto this trial. Yeah.
Is there a database where people can list their names for the trials that, when they do come up?
That's a great idea. It sort of tends to work the other way around a bit more efficiently, where there are databases for clinical trials open for recruitment. So most of your doctors will have an app called Australian New Zealand Clinical Trial Referral App. They're not very imaginative with their names, but they can easily dial in and go ITP, New South Wales, what's active? And when I did that last night, there's nothing. Dial into Queensland, the PRN 1008 comes up. And so it's quite reasonable every time you see your haematologist. If you are someone with ITP that's a bit brittle and you're still looking for something a bit better, it doesn't hurt to ask, hey, by the way, have you got that app on your phone? Can you see what else is going on? To be honest, it is it's not easy to just like if you lived in Wollongong and the trial is only open in Sydney, it would mean travelling backwards and forwards quite a lot. Sometimes a trial doesn't involve too many face-to-face visits and you can get away with it, and so sometimes you can overcome those distances, but often it involves a lot of investment.
Isn't there an international one of those, the clinical trials database?
So there's clinical trials registries like clinicaltrials.gov, I think.
Clinicaltrials.gov.
Yeah, so, and absolutely you can, but what you'll find is there's a lot of stuff there, and it takes a bit of medical jargon deciphering to understand what's useful, what's not. But if you go onto it now, for example, and if you didn't restrict it to any particular country, you'd find a lot of stuff about the things that I listed, basically, came from a search of that recently that I did. So there's a lot of stuff coming out of China. Some of it's with medical products. A lot of it's with natural sort of remedies. There are a lot of registry type studies, and we in Canberra, for example, biobank everyone with low platelet counts, and that sort of feeds into what I was saying before about how a way of going forward with this disease is more than just trying to find a silver bullet. It's trying to find which bullet goes for which target. And if we are stuck with the same tools to say that I can only diagnose you with something called ITP, I don't have the tools to figure out which bullet to use for you, so I'm just going to have to go down the list alphabetically. So what I'm trying to do, what we're trying to do in Canberra with our research program, is to try to find ways of subdividing people with ITP and saying, yeah, you have a form of ITP, but maybe yours involves a problem with the megakaryocytes in the bone marrow, or maybe yours involves the liver a little bit more, and this thing called decylation of platelets, or maybe yours is just really the spleen. Just take out the spleen and then you'll be fine. Or, if there's ways of selecting what's best for you, wouldn't you rather just do that rather than go through magic bullet after magic bullet?
Treating the cause, not the symptom.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of us were a bit naive and we thought that's what our doctors were doing, our haematologists were actually doing that process. And then I think once you got dug a bit deeper, no, they were just doing first line, second line, third line treatment because
That's
again,
right.
the government's got it all
Yeah,
controlled. There's the controlled trial.
Yeah.
This is what we're going to offer you. And like you said, we just all get slipped into each. Yeah, but I assumed she was, or he, whoever it is, was doing that.
So the thing that's fascinating me is that actually a lot of that information's already there. We know that there are these unique problems in ITP involving these types of cells and those types of cells and these types of cells, but we don't really have a bird's eye view of if someone responds really well to romiplostim, which of those pathways is it okay to have a disease in, right? Or if someone's just going to do really well on steroids and rituximab, wouldn't it be great to go into that knowing that your immune system kind of fits the profile of someone who's going to do okay? And I think splenectomy is another great example of that, where how many of you have had a conversation early on in your ITP career with your GP or your haematologist that, look, there's this thing called splenectomy, we can take it out, we try to avoid it, but I do need to let you know historically it tends to work really well. But those success rates are probably about 60 to 70% if you have your spleen taken out after 6 weeks of using steroids and you still have ITP. So that data sort of relates more to early disease rather than later disease. So we don't really know what your real success rate is 5 years down the track, because we actually don't have data on what the real success rate of splenectomy is after 5 years of treatment, unless I'm mistaken. And yeah, you've been really unlucky so far, but I think you're going to be lucky now with your spleen taken out. Most of you will feel already, that.
That's how I was diagnosed.
Yeah.
We were just really unlucky people.
Yeah, most of you will probably feel that if you've gone this far and nothing else has worked, why would you be one of the lucky 60%? And so if there was, again, a way of being able to, and we were talking about this last night, of doing a scan, for example, to say, yeah, the spleen is the hotbed of activity, let's get rid of that hotbed. And if we could be confident in that information and that interpretation, then yeah, let's go ahead and do it. And look, there have been publications showing results, almost 80% sort of success rate that way, but we don't really know how well controlled those studies are and what the true denominators should be. And so, like I say, it is very hard because there's data out there, but there's no bird's eye view. And there's no way of then using that information about what happened to 20 people in China in a particular experiment and how that's going to help your treatment, how that's going to convince your doctor to give you a particular drug. Because your ITP might be very different to the 20 people that were involved in that study. Because our tools that we have right now, the jargon we use, the terminology we use isn't refined enough to be able to have that language or that discourse. We can't even talk about it. Not yet. But like I said, this is the kind of direction that I see ITP needing to go forward into the 21st century, because the more we try to target treatments, the more we find that we get a good success rate we get good results for a small subset of people. Yeah. So, any other questions? Yeah, so Phil Campbell is the haematologist down in Geelong that does occasionally do it. The problem, again, with Australia is for us to get indium, and this may have changed, but I think it comes via Canada, goes to the UK, and then comes down to Melbourne. It has to get shipped a long distance, and there's a lot of decay that happens by the time it gets to Australia, and it comes via Melbourne. So even trying to get it to Sydney, everything was coming through Melbourne. And I can only imagine how much harder it is trying to set it up in Brisbane. So look, all I can say is that I know that he's done it. It's a tool that's used to try to help the doctor and the patient make a more informed decision before they proceed to a splenectomy. Right now, our regulatory body doesn't allow us to use that as negative evidence for not needing to go through a splenectomy. So please let us have the romiplostim, the ultrasound that we know is probably going to work, but please excuse us from having to go through this dreaded surgery.
So can I ask, once you've been diagnosed with ITP, do you always have ITP?
That's a really interesting question.
Because I found that I had ITP by accident because I had to have major surgery, went through all the steroids and all that kind of thing, and that didn't work. Now I've had my spleen out, so where am I on the spectrum then? Do I still have ITP or?
Yeah. Do you know what your most recent platelet counts are?
I think is it around 220 or something?
Yeah, and that's a few years ago that you had.
No, that's probably about 3 months ago.
Oh,
And I
okay.
had my spleen out in 2015.
Okay. So if you had a high blood pressure and your GP put you onto blood pressure pills, and now your blood pressure is normal, do you still have hypertension?
I don't have
Yeah, but like, I guess the analogy is sometimes when we use a treatment that makes things look like everything's back to normal, it doesn't mean that you're actually cured. And I mean, Terry's experience is much longer than mine, but it's true that many years down the track from a splenectomy, I'll see a patient who maybe had their spleen taken out before I was even a doctor, and they've come back to me with a relapse. And in that person, you know, it's not that he's had a second disease or he's had a second bout of ITP. It's he had ITP. It was well controlled when the spleen got taken out, but it was always hiding there. And then he got the flu and it came back. And that's a common story, isn't it? I would say, out of respect to you, that it so far so good. And congratulations, you know, on that outcome, because it's a brave thing to do. But I couldn't. I don't think anyone would know. And before you told me about the splenectomy, the other thing I would also say is what I was saying earlier on. I hold very dearly true that as doctors, we don't always know you have ITP. We have a really good guess at it. We know that you probably fit the pattern after we've met you a few times. But the number of times I'd be called from the emergency room about someone with a platelet count of 1, and we just have to start something because you're bleeding, but we don't know you have ITP. And then the thing goes away, and then you never have a low platelet count ever again. Was that really ITP or just a bad viral infection that came and went? And unfortunately, your My Health record will probably say you had ITP, but not that you'd be able to tap into it or change it or affect it until next time you went into hospital. So the diagnosis of ITP is, to me, something that irks me because, you know, I also work in cancer and haematology cancers, and for us, when you're trying to treat a cancer, the diagnosis is so critical before you go down the pathway of using cytotoxic chemicals and surgery, and the diagnosis is so key that sometimes we force people to have multiple biopsies and surgeries just to get the diagnosis right. before we start any treatment. ITP, it's almost the other way around. We start the treatment and we go, yes, you've responded like ITP. This looks like ITP now. Now I recognise you because I gave you intragram, your platelets went up. I'm convinced you got ITP now. Whereas before your doctor gave you that intragram, when you didn't respond to prednisone, I bet you any money your doctor would be sitting there going, oh, I wonder if this really is ITP, if you didn't respond to steroids. And so that's, again, backwards. And again, for me, in my career, in what I want to do with ITP, that's the kind of thing I want to do for the next 20, 30 years of my working research life, to see if there are better ways of diagnosing this thing, better ways of classifying it, so that we can feed that into treatment algorithms. All right? Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Just wanted to say thank you very much to all of the doctors that have donated their time, other than the bowl of bread, of course, to coming and presenting today. Obviously, wouldn't have been the same type of meeting without them. We probably wouldn't have even had the meeting for these guys all being in the same location at one given time. Also want to say a big thank you to the PDSA as well. Without getting that email from Caroline Cruz, I wouldn't have known that the medical conference was in town. I wouldn't have been able to reach out to these guys, and today's event wouldn't have happened. So thanks, Caroline, even though you weren't able to make it, mate. Thank you. And also thank you very much for everybody else for donating their weekend. Like, I totally get it. It's it's a full day. It's a whole lot of information. Like, my mind is still spinning, and I suppose I've been on this journey now for a little while as well, but still learning a lot more about ITP and anything that ITP Australia can do to help, 1, raise awareness, 2, educate, and 3, support, the better. So thanks so much, everybody.